All right, so you guys have already done quite a bit of background research on Athens versus Sparta, and you've been doing an amazing job within your debate of pulling the information out of those primary documents in the textbook and forming cases for the positives and the negatives of both Athens and Sparta. So while I'm gone this week, I just want to make sure that we clarify the information about each one of these poli. And the reason why is very soon you're going to see these two poli come to a head with each other and clash in a massive war. So we need to understand how fundamentally different each one of these poli were and why each one was as powerful as they were as well. So please write this down. The two most powerful poli, Athens and Sparta. So Athens, why are they so incredibly wealthy? Well, as you guys know, it has to do with location, geographic luck. They were a massive trade center right on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And you can see here the Aegean Sea being right here and Athens being here in the center of all the trade routes coming from the Black Sea through the Aegean Sea and through the rest of the Mediterranean. So aside from their location, they really didn't have a lot that they could produce except for really small-scale agriculture, specifically olive oil. They were one of the main producers of olive oil within all of Greece. And as you can see from the trade routes, they would bring this olive oil and it would go all the way over to Egypt, over here into North Africa, Italy, as well as into Central Asia. And so they really were the main providers of this resource. And so because of the olive oil and their location, they became a very, very wealthy trade center. Early on in the Athenian government, even though we tend to think of them as a democracy, originally there was something called a tyranny. A tyranny is what we think of when we think of a dictatorship. A tyranny is when you have a government that's run by one single, extremely strong leader. So we call this a tyranny, or we call it a tyrannical dictatorship. So a lot of times when we think of these kingdoms where we have a king that has absolute power, technically that's a tyranny. However, throughout the history of Athens, eventually because of trade, we ended up getting a social class, the middle class, the merchants, who became very, very wealthy. And just like in any society in the world, as people gain wealth, they feel as if they should have more of a say in the government and political decisions. And that is exactly what happened in Athens. So after centuries of being a tyranny, the middle class, these wealthy merchants who became very, very rich from trade, decided that they wanted to have more control over the decisions within Athens. It was because of this that we eventually developed the very first democracy in the world, and this was in the year 508 BC. So a democracy, if you look at the word, it technically is two separate words. Demo, meaning people, and cracy, meaning government. So the word democracy literally means a government by the people. Remember we learned about demography last year in geography? Demography being the study of people. So democracy being the people ruling their own government. So democracy, government ruled by the people. And remember, this nowadays is the number one form of government throughout the world. However, this was the first time that we truly introduced it in a big, organized way. And the way that their democracy is different than our democracy today is they had something called a direct democracy. And this has been brought up during the debate. A direct democracy is where every citizen, especially at this point, every male citizen, had the right to give their opinion and make a decision on every single law. Today, because we have such big populations and such huge societies, we can't do this any longer. It's not an efficient process. And so that's why today we have something called a representative democracy. Instead of every single person voting on every single law, because that would take forever, we instead vote for a representative in our government. This could be a governor, this could be a mayor, this could be a senator, and then they make a decision for us. We've given them the power, but we've elected them to make that decision. Greece, because it was very small, it was never larger than 40,000 people, they could have a direct democracy, which means that every person, at least every free male citizen over the age of 15, was able to have a direct vote on every law. You can see why this might cause some problems, right? First off, it's a slow process, and also because of the fact that you could probably have quite a bit of conflict this way. Sparta, on the other hand, as you already know, was a type of monarchy. There were a government that had two kings. The technical word, and all of you have used this very well in the debate, is an oligarchy. An oligarchy is any government where you have a council of people that work together to make decisions. So Sparta was an oligarchy because first they had two sitting kings, and then as you know from the primary document and the textbook, they also had a council of elders. And so these were people that worked together to make decisions for the community. So not every person had the right to make a choice within their government. Instead, they had almost like a representative government. They had people who made decisions for them. And because no one person had too much power, and they all worked together to make decisions, that's why we call it an oligarchy, because it's many people making decisions. We also know that because of their location, they were never a trade center. And we do know that was one of the few places in Greece where they could actually grow wheat and barley. This is what allowed for them to become A, wealthy, because everybody wanted their wheat and barley. But secondly, this is why they became a super powerful military force. And that's because, since they were one of the few places that could actually grow grain, they had to be able to protect their grain. And this is why they ended up developing into a very, very powerful military, because they had to protect their very valuable resource, which was wheat. And so this is how they developed into their militaristic society that we think of today. So the key to Spartan society, aside from their wealth from growing wheat, would then be their military strength. And this is kind of legend, right? Movies like 300. The Spartans developed a military in order to protect their fertile farmland. And they really and truly were the best military within all of Greece. What we're going to see, though, is that they had the best military on land. Guess what Athens had, because they were a trade center? They had the best military on the ocean, otherwise known as a navy. And that's something that's going to be very important when we get to a war that they end up fighting, and that's called the Peloponnesian War. We'll be learning about that very shortly. The other thing about Spartan social structure that we care about, and again, this was brought up, is they kind of are an early form of communism, right? They believed that all Spartan men were equal. Notice I'm not saying slaves and I'm not saying women. They believed all Spartan men were equal. They didn't have social classes. Remember in the primary documents, it said it was outlawed for men to do any other job other than be a warrior. And because of that, everyone was expected to be equal, and therefore they would all fight for each other. Well, because all the men were so busy in the military fighting, and they happened to be very good farmland, they needed people to actually farm the land and harvest the crops. Well, this is why they ended up with one of the largest slave classes in Greece. 80% of the Spartan civilization was made up of those slaves, and we've heard you guys use this word. They're called helots. The helots were the ones that worked the farmland for the soldiers. And this is going to become key when we talk about the war with Athens. If you have a society where the majority of people in your society are oppressed with no rights and they're slaves, guess what's probably going to end up happening? And we're going to learn about how that ended up happening in Sparta and affecting their civilization. However, the big cultural values that they end up developing within Sparta that made them so strong because of their military is, first off, discipline. They cared more about people obeying orders than people being creative and educated. Also, because they're military, they cared about courage and bravery. And these were things that maybe we didn't see in Athens. which instead was a very wealthy trade center, and so they cared about other things that we'll be talking about. Alright guys, so these are your notes to help you understand Sparta versus Athens a little bit more. If you have any questions, please let me know.